Thank you, President Karas, General Nakasone, ladies and gentlemen, but also colleagues and friends. I'm indeed delighted to be back here in Tallinn and to be here on this stage at CyCon for the first time. It's a flagship conference for a very complex issue. And it's been a while since we've been together in person. Yet here we are again today, grappling with the persistent challenges, but also the unparalleled opportunities of cyberspace and the emerging and disruptive technologies that it enables. I'm grateful to be part of this strong cyber community of which Estonia plays a pivotal role. You lead by example. You are never afraid to think outside of the box, and you support those that need our help. You inspire us as a truly digitized nation. And we're grateful for your contributions to NATO. And one such contribution is as the host of the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence here in Tallinn. The CCDCOE is a curator of knowledge, of expertise, and of ideas. And these ideas underpin the NATO alliance. They support the very notion that we can achieve more when we work together. As the threat landscape develops and as technology advances, when we keep moving together. One thing remains constant, and that is our values, of Europe and North America standing together and united in a shared mission, to defend 1 billion people living in our allied nations, to defend them in the physical world, but also in the digital world, now and in the future. This conference comes at an unprecedented time. We face a profoundly changed security environment, and cyberspace has been central to the war in Ukraine. It has been used to shape the battle space. Cyber attacks were used to lay the ground for the invasion, to disable Ukrainian communications and the ability for the government to communicate with its people, but also to distort the narrative through disinformation. In recent months, we've seen cyber attacks with data-wiping malware continue to target Ukrainian entities in government, commercial, and energy sectors to paralyze computer systems. Some of this malware has had cascading impacts beyond Ukraine's borders. The hack on the KASAT satellite network, for example, affected internet connectivity for tens of thousands of people across Europe. Many NATO allies, including Estonia, have attributed this attack to Russia, condemning the attack in the strongest terms. In recent weeks, we saw failed attempts to disrupt the Ukrainian power grid, which could have left millions of people in the dark. And in recent days, we've seen further warnings from our governments against potential cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in response to support provided to Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia. Protecting and securing cyberspace is not something any one nation, any one alliance, any one continent can do alone, which is why an alliance like NATO and its partnership network across the globe are so vital during this critical moment for our shared security. Today, I'd like to reflect on three main themes. First, on the strategic importance of cyber for current and future conflicts. Then second, on what we're doing and what more we need to do to respond to the changed security environment. And third and lastly, on the role of cyberspace and the emerging and disruptive technologies that it enables in the new strategic concept for NATO and beyond that time. So first, some initial observations on the strategic importance of cyber for current and future conflicts. It's important to see cyberspace for what it is. It is a contested space. And unlike other domains, it is always on. There's constant friction and continuous activity, a blurring of the lines between peace, crisis, and conflict, as already mentioned by the General. These unique characteristics challenge traditional thinking on deterrence. It is not possible to prevent and deter all cyber activities. So we have to shift our thinking towards a more proactive approach. We must understand that cyberspace is a means to achieve strategic effects. The scale of the pre-kinetic, destructive cyber operations that took place in Ukraine was unprecedented. Initial observations suggest that cyber means can achieve effects, not necessarily in the form of shock and awe events, but through more insidious and persistent campaigns. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine began, the importance of cyber as an enabler and a complement to traditional kinetic war became apparent. but it's also a domain where effects can be achieved in their own right, and we need to think about it this way. Finally, cyberspace is a shared space with many actors, not just governments. During the war in Ukraine, we've seen the private sector take up a critical role in defending against cyber attacks. While we have been talking about public-private partnerships for years already, the events of the last months truly have seen a new level of engagement between public and private sectors to advance international peace and security. So an initial takeaway from the war in Ukraine is that cyberspace is an area of strategic competition and conflict between states, and that cyberspace can only be defended and secured in a collaborative spirit. So with that, let me turn to the second theme, how NATO is responding to this changed security environment and what more I believe we should consider doing about it. And as I've recognized, cyber defense is part of NATO's core task of collective defense. And in line with NATO's defensive mandate, they are determined to employ the full range of capabilities at all times to actively deter, defend against, and to counter the full spectrum of cyber threats. And if necessary, allies will impose costs on those who harm them. Allies are also making greater use of NATO as a platform for political consultations. They are sharing information and concerns, exchanging national approaches, as well as considering possible collective responses. And this became evident once again when senior cyber coordinators from NATO allies came together for a first special meeting at the North Atlantic Council 2 weeks ago. Allies there discussed how the alliance's cyber capabilities and defenses should evolve and how to enhance our collective posture in response to recent developments in the cyber threat landscape. To support these collective efforts, allies are bolstering their national resilience in the face of potential cyber incidents, targeting especially now critical infrastructure. Through NATO's Cyber Defense Pledge, we see continued investments in national strategies, capabilities, and skills. And looking beyond borders, working closely with like-minded partners and organizations, including the European Union, is another key pillar of our approach. We are enhancing consultations with Finland and Sweden, whilst also working closely with partner nations such as Ukraine, Georgia, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. There are rules that govern cyberspace, and we need to uphold them together. Looking ahead, there are a few areas where I believe there is a need for further action. The first is very much embodied in the spirit of fora such as this and bodies like the CCDCOE. And I'm talking here about partnerships, as was already mentioned by previous speakers. Partnerships that span civilian and military fields, public and private sectors, and national and international spheres. Defending our values and the rules-based international order is a collective effort. And so too is building capacity and helping others to shore up their defenses. A second area that requires attention in my mind focuses in particular on engagement across public and private sectors. I mentioned at the outset the important role that many private sector actors are playing in Ukraine to respond to incidents, share information, ensure backups of data, and keep systems up and running. This engagement is remarkable, and it needs to be further embedded within our longer-term approach to tackling persistent, malicious cyber activities and campaigns. Related to this is the notion of resilience. The fundamentals haven't changed, but our efforts must intensify. We've placed a priority on this at NATO, and allies are also doing their part. While cyber defense remains the responsibility of each ally, NATO is a platform where allies are helping each other raise their overall level of resilience. More broadly, as allies address ways to strengthen NATO's longer-term deterrence and defense posture, it is clear that cyber defense will play a key role in this. So to sum up, NATO's approach to cyber defense is multifaceted. While we have achieved much in recent years, there's much more that we need to bolster our defenses in the long term. With that, as promised, let me turn to the future. Cyberspace and the emerging and disruptive technologies it enables will be at the core of strategic competition between states. Technologies such as AI, autonomous systems, big data, biotech, and quantum are changing the world and our everyday lives. They're also changing the way the alliance operates. They provide us with new opportunities for our militaries, helping them to become more effective, resilient, and sustainable. But they also represent, on the other side, new threats. And that is why NATO and its allies have placed a priority on fostering and protecting our technological edge. Allies recognize that new technologies will form the backbone of our deterrence and defense posture, and they're taking steps to stay ahead. And this is being done through some new initiatives, such as the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, or in short, DIANA, which will foster our transatlantic innovation ecosystem for defense and security purposes. And through the NATO Innovation Fund, a multinationally funded effort to provide venture financing to cutting-edge startups that are developing dual-use technologies. These initiatives will also enable us to advance our work in specific technology areas, such as implementing NATO's first AI strategy that was adopted last autumn. To this end, we're also looking at the strategic implication of AI for our cyber defenses. For example, AI can support the defending side by allowing better detection and response to cyber attacks. But at the same time, the same AI can also enable malicious actors to scale and refine their attacks and make them more difficult to be detected. We're also looking at early-stage innovations, such as quantum computing. Research shows that quantum computers will be capable of breaking much of the cryptography that currently secures our digital communications on the internet. And that's not in the too far future. So in an era of strategic competition and conflict, maintaining and sharpening our technological edge will be a decisive element as we stand together to protect our citizens and also our values. And NATO will continue to do its part to ensure the responsible use of these technologies and that cyberspace is free, open, and secure. Ladies and gentlemen, international stability has been challenged in the recent months. Peace on the European continent has been fundamentally shattered. There is war on a scale and of a nature that we thought belonged to history. And this war has demonstrated the strategic importance of cyber for current and for future conflicts. We recognize the contested nature of cyberspace, and we recognize the need to develop multifaceted responses across civilian and military, public and private, national and international spheres as part of a collective effort. And we also recognize that while progress has been made to strengthen our collective cyber resilience, there's much more to be done. We can't stand still. We must continue to harness cyberspace and the emerging and disruptive technologies it enables for our long-term defense and deterrence. Later this month, NATO leaders will gather in Madrid to agree on a new strategic concept for the alliance. This is our blueprint for keeping our 1 billion people safe in the decade to come. This pivotal moment requires our collective resolve to secure the future of democracy, the future of principles, and our values. These values are the most precious assets of NATO alliance. We're united in defending them, now and in the future, and also in cyberspace. Thank you.
Mr. Assistant Secretary General has kindly agreed to answer a couple of questions, so please be brave, raise your hand, and our volunteers will bring you the microphone.
Only easy ones, please.
Yep, only easy ones. Do I see a hand? There is one, yep.
Thank you. There's been a lot of emphasis on public-private partnership, as the General discussed. From the perspective of NATO and NATO partners, what exactly could the private sector do or isn't doing at this time that could further enable your mission and sort of help in a critical time where we have entirely different priorities?
Yeah, well, I think that what we're seeing in the war in Ukraine is not completely new. We always had our cooperation with the private sector, whether it was in sharing indicators of compromise or looking at possible mitigation of zero-day errors. I think what Ukraine told us is that the private sector has an insight into what's happening on networks on a scale that we at NATO, for example, don't have. Also in areas where we don't have any jurisdiction ourselves. And that the private sector has capabilities for example, in moving the Ukrainian government administration to the cloud, that we as a collective sector could never do in such a short time. So that's what I mean by having to rethink how we have this permanent cooperation when it comes down to sharing awareness, information, but also looking at mitigation and support in countering ongoing threats on a more structured scale. Coming from the same values, which as we're seeing now is the case with our tech companies as well, who are more than willing to stand in, to help at no cost when it really matters, like now in Ukraine. So I can't tell you when and where will come a very concrete new ideas, but I can tell you that we're in the process of looking at a more structured permanent cooperation in the realm of cyberspace between NATO and the private sector.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions in the audience? There is a hand up front here.
Thank you very much for joining us. I wonder if you could elaborate perhaps on some of the newer initiatives undertaken with partner nations of NATO in the cyber domain as we look at what's going on in Ukraine and the need for us to work with new partners and allies.
Yeah, I think Ukraine has underlined the importance of cyber as a domain, as I said, but also as a domain in itself, with clear impact for all sectors of society. So what we notice is we've been helping Ukraine since 2014 in bolstering their cyber defenses as an alliance. But we now notice that there are partners that are probably at risk to some point who are knocking on our door to get that same kind of support in bolstering their own cyber defenses. So in Ukraine at the moment, of course, the main effort is on countering the attacks that are ongoing, and there's not much useful thing that NATO can do there as an alliance per se. Allies on a bilateral basis and the private sector are assisting in that ongoing effort, but for other partner nations, they're very much keen and eager to get that kind of structural support that raises the level of their resilience. And in the end, we live in an interconnected world, as was said earlier in a speech. So the idea that partners will be affected and that we wouldn't be, that there wouldn't be any spillover effects or any secondary effects of major cyber breaches of partner nations is an illusion. If a national network breaks down, it could lead to food shortages, it could lead to migration, it could lead to lawlessness in partner countries bordering our alliance. So definitely cyber defense and cyber security is not something that stops at the borders of the alliance, but goes well beyond.
Thank you, sir. I was pointed out there was a hand in this general. Yes, there is a hand. Okay. And after that, we'll have one more question. So think ahead, plan.
When you talk about the civil sector and the military sector or the NATO sector coming together, how do you see the convergence between what we see in the civil sector represented in Europe by legislation like the NIS directive, where we have strong regimes already, and how do you see them merging with your intentions of addressing especially the critical infrastructure sector from the NATO side?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I mentioned the European Union in my speech as a very close partner. The benefit of the European Union when it comes down to this speech is that it can actually provide legislation, hard law. The benefit of NATO in this sphere is that we can provide soft law. We can look only at the security and defense implications of certain interactions, for example, with the private sector, which you can then feed into the lawmaking process on the European, but also on the other side of the ocean, in order to make sure that any legislation that's being drawn up doesn't impede the security and defense needs that we have. For example, when it comes down to sharing information in crisis time. So the aim of this collaboration is indeed to start this dialogue, to have a more closer interaction into, for example, the benefits, but also the limitations of legislation on data storage in a physical domain. And to give you an example, that in Ukraine, moving the government services to the cloud was actually a protective measure that required a change in legislation on the Ukrainian side. So what might be very obvious from one point of view, looking through a lens of privacy, might have limitations on the security aspects or risks that we run on the defense side. And this interaction is what we need to take into account. So looking at the security implication of all other choices that we make, whether it be in our economic resilience, in our energy security dependencies, but also in cyber domain.
Thank you, sir. And there is Lisa. Oh, there is two hands. We'll see how we're doing with time, but Lisa was first. Yeah.
Good morning. Thanks, Lisa. Maybe we can share. I had just a quick question, sort of transparency and information sharing. I was wondering if you can, if you would like to share from your perspective, NATO alliance current cyber domain, let's say last half a year, did you experience sort of attacks? What would be your description of the last, particularly this last half a year of cyber domain in the alliance? What is the situation? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll answer it as far as I can without going into any classified information. But I think the general feeling is that although we have seen some attacks on allies and allied nations, that they were not comparable to the size, scale, and sophistication of the operations that we've seen in Ukraine. And anyone can draw their own conclusions on why that is, whether it is Russia trying to avoid coming into direct confrontation with NATO, or they simply have a focus of their capacities in Ukraine, but that's something that we've noticed. At the same time, we've also noticed, like the CASA attack, that they've taken deliberate choices with which they knew there would most certainly be collateral damage also in allied countries. So the CASA attack, which had implications in a number of allied countries, was something that they took for granted. So that's some new behavior that we saw. And of course, those secondary effects can be just as detrimental as the first order effects, as we've seen with the NotPetya attack. So there is a reason for real caution, both being prepared for direct attacks, but also for secondary collateral damage.
And I know I have no future in Estonian cyber community if I ignore Lisa's question, so Lisa, you got to have it.
And that makes you an officer, Jaak, that will have a long and bright future anywhere in the world. My question, Deputy Secretary General, speaks to the capability planning paradox or the dilemma of the allies. In this skill and competence shortage that we inevitably live in, the allies, you can understand, would be tempted to keep their best and brightest at home to solve the pressing issues or problems at home. At the same time, we're all allies because we believe in the alliance in NATO as a force multiplier. What do you think can either allies or the alliance itself do more to make sure that we're all incentivized to collectively deploy the best and brightest?
Well, of course, I would say that we already have the best and the brightest at NATO coming from your countries. But it is true that in the more sensitive domains, we really need to prove to individual allies that NATO is a force multiplier. We all get it when we speak about tanks or aircraft or the NATO command structure. But where cyber came from, at first being used mostly in the intelligence community and being below the radar, we see the same challenge as we've seen but with special forces, that there needs to be a high degree of trust before we share the real information that then makes sure that we have that force multiplier there, which would then incentivize nations to make sure that NATO is the hub where you need to send your brightest in order to get the most benefit out from NATO. I think we've made big steps since declaring cyber domain in 2014, but more steps are to be made. So working on that trust, first of all, our new CIO is sitting here on the front row, working on the cybersecurity of our own networks, which is a baseline requirement, but at the same time creating more of a framework for sharing information at a higher degree of complexity will enable NATO to offer as the platform what it is. If nations don't bring to NATO their capabilities, then it is just a very big building in the middle of Brussels. So the power is to collectively combine those capabilities, train together, so you can also operate together when it's needed. And cyber is no different in that respect from any other domain.
Sir, you have handled challenging questions exceptionally well. Is there a burning question, or we have the opportunity? There is a burning question. Sir, you want to take one more?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. It's your coffee.
Sorry for standing in the way. Very quick one. You talked about PPP quite a lot. How do you see how to better draw a line in terms of what data and which tools to use from the private sector in the public cloud, in the sort of their realm, and then give the power of the hosting of those solutions to them, and which ones still to keep within NATO's and nations' militaries' internal assets?
That's a very big question, and I could talk for hours on the answer to that. But in short, what we've seen, especially with these new EDTs, is that the military is no longer leading in the innovation sphere there. There's tons of reasons for that, declining in R&D budgets, the defense market being too small, the commercial market having become very successful in quickly scaling up new technologies. But the fact is there that we are no longer leading in areas like autonomy, AI, the use of big data. So we need to catch up. And catching up means recognizing that this is mostly a civilian and private sector-led endeavor, but that we need to be there with initiatives to make sure that we're early adapters to this technology, that we can make sure that the dual-use purposes of new technologies are being built into new capabilities from the beginning. And I mentioned Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund as two initiatives to do just that. We want to pose challenging problems to innovation ecosystems without delineating what kind of capabilities might be the answer, what kind of technology might be the answer, and thereby tapping into the enormous innovation potential that we have in our allied countries in order to be early adapters. And I would say that in most cases, we will strive for that to be a dual-use product. So no longer a strict delineation between military prime companies and civilian companies. Most of these technologies will always have a dual use, and that's good because it also means that there's a commercially viable business case behind those technologies. And as we know, the innovation cycles in these technologies are so high that our operational requirements process would have a difficulty in keeping up and being the main incentivizer for that. So work in progress, I would say.
Sir, thank you for your leadership in NATO. Thank you for your continued support to CCDCOE and CyCon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.